which obviously we're very familiar with and accustomed to, which are the main tool within many of our organisations to help resolve disputes and conflicts. So today we're talking about a resolution, and I'll be introducing to you a common sense approach to dispute resolution. Some people describe what we do here at TCM as being progressive. Some people call it happy clappy. Some people call it pink and fluffy. Some people call it transformative, and others call it powerful. I call it talking to each other. And for me, that's at the heart of what we do as mediators. It's at the heart of effective resolution systems within organisations. Yeah, when I work with organisations to look at the systems for dispute resolution within their organisations, what I often find is they are very well geared up and very well developed to actually prevent and block people from communicating with each other effectively. And what I'll be proposing to you today are systems of tools and approaches to help you to unblock the barriers for dialogue, to help you unblock the barriers for communication, and in doing so, build opportunities for people to find collaborative, positive, and powerful outcomes to their disputes and conflicts. And in doing so, enhance your organisation, promote productivity, build employee engagement, build a happier, stronger workforce, and ultimately give your organisation a competitive advantage and give you the opportunity to drive economic growth within your business. So a little bit about our organisation. Just switch to move the slide. So welcome then to TCM. So we've been in business for 12 years. I set the company up in 2001. Prior to that, I ran a mediation charity in Leicester. My first area of work was in neighbour disputes. If any of you have ever experienced a neighbour dispute or ever been a mediator in a neighbour dispute, you'll know that it's a tough place to be. And I earned my stripes as a mediator working on the streets of Leicester trying to bring warring neighbours around the table in the 90s. I also worked in schools. I developed a program called CRIS, the Conflict Resolution in Schools program, promoting non-violence and mediation in schools, playgrounds and classrooms across Leicestershire, and then increasingly on a national basis. And I also pioneered work in the area of restorative justice and still very active in that area, bringing victims and offenders together to meet with each other or to exchange letters to give a victim an opportunity to have a stake in the justice process, and for the victim to for the offender to understand the impact of their behaviour on a real person or on a real victim. I learned a lot from that work, and I was surprised when I went into organisations and started talking to people about their experience of conflict, bullying and harassment in their organisations. And what they were telling me is, I don't want to come into work in the morning. I don't feel safe in my organisation. This is having an impact on my life. This is having an impact on my well-being. And I thought this sounds very similar to people I've talked to recently who've had crimes committed against them, who've had handbags snatched or having their houses robbed. And much like my work when I was working in communities, I was often shocked at how little was being done within communities to resolve disputes effectively and constructively. And likewise within organisations, when I looked at the systems, the culture and the processes within organisations, I too was shocked at how little was being done to resolve disputes constructively and effectively, and how a reliance on an often adversarial system for dispute resolution was the only real mechanism that was in place within organisations. We now employ a team of full-time mediators and trainers based here in London. We have a team of consultants working across the UK providing conflict resolution, change management and consultancy services for organisations across the UK and overseas. I'm lucky enough to be the president, and we're founder members of our trade body for mediators in the UK, the Professional Mediators Association, and we offer outstanding customer service, and we've recently secured accreditation with Customer First. Apologies about this dialogue, that box that keeps appearing. It looks like we've just oversubscribed on the webinar, which is great, shows it's very popular, but unfortunately it looks like people are trying to dial in and not being fortunate enough to get on. So I think I may have to rerun this. So thanks everyone for joining me, and sorry to those who weren't able to get on. So this is the kind of stuff that organisations are dealing with. At one end of the spectrum, I suppose some people might call them petty quarrels, disagreements, falling outs, not seeing eye to eye. For those of you who've dealt with issues about who drank out of whose coffee cup and whether or not the window should be open in the office or the window should be closed, or how to give information between two shop jar partners on a Wednesday afternoon when they meet each other for an hour, we'll know that those issues aren't petty. They're very real and have a very significant impact on those individuals. Moving into a more serious level, we start using words like disagreements, grievances, more serious discrimination, harassment, and of course at the more serious end of the spectrum, we start talking about compromise agreements or settlement agreements, as they're now known, of course, employment tribunals, court cases, and so on. What we're talking about in particular is conflict and how organisations handle and react to conflict. And one of my observations when I'm working with organisations about and helping them to transform their attitudes to conflict is it occurs to me that most organisations' views of conflict is that it's a negative and destructive force. In some respects, it's the negative outcome of interpersonal relationships, and it's an outcome which we should mitigate or prevent the risk of that conflict impacting the organisation. And most dispute resolution systems, grievance, disciplinary, bullying and harassment policies and procedures exist to reduce the harm to the organisation from this phenomenon called conflict, rather than a genuine desire to actually resolve the root cause and the underlying cause of conflict. So organisations, for me, perceive conflict as a negative necessary evil of the organisation, and they manage it as a negative element of the organisation, avoiding it, not wanting to deal with it, not talking about it, sometimes denying it even exists within our organisation. And when I'm talking to businesses, I'll often say, I'm not a mediator, I'm a PR agent for conflict. Because my view of conflict is when it's managed well and when it's managed effectively, it can transform relationships, it can promote dialogue, it can actually build high-performing, productive teams. Bruce Tuckman tells us that teams go through 4 natural stages of development: forming, storming, norming, and performing. Well, storming, the kind of conflict stage, is a stage that all teams will go through as they're getting to know each other and they're starting to work collaboratively to achieve the shared, or to identify and achieve the shared outcomes of the organisation. In fact, literature tells us that the most high-performing teams within organisations regularly will move from performing to storming. So conflict, therefore, is not just it's not a necessary evil of the organisation. It's a core function of how teams develop. So today's webinar is going to focus on moving and shifting and transforming our attitude of conflict from destructive to constructive. Now, the good news is our economy seems to be recovering somewhat, and that's obviously positive news for any of us who are running businesses. But back in 2011, in the midst of the economic turmoil that we were experiencing, Vince Cable, the business secretary, so someone we should really be listening to, made a very powerful statement. He repeated this last year at the party conference, and David Cameron picked up on a similar comment. And what Vince Cable said is, we now face a crisis that is the economic equivalent of war. This is not a time for business as usual. And I guess when the press picked up on these statements and we examine it, we might be thinking about LIBOR fixing rate, big city firms, city governance, banking restructuring and banking reform. And of course, Vince Cable was referring to that when he made this statement. But for me, when I think about businesses and how they function, the most important aspect of the business is the conversations that are happening between your employees and between your employees and their managers. Those conversations that are happening in offices, around water coolers, in supervision meetings, in appraisal meetings, in the informal or more formal connections that happen, the way that the psychological contract is shaped and developed between an employee and a manager. Those are the most important conversations that happen within our organizations. And when those conversations go wrong, and when the communication breaks down, and when the personalities clash, those relationships can have a serious and detrimental impact on the business. And the cost of conflict to business is great, and we'll explore that through the webinar. But the cost of conflict is no longer just a hidden element of the organization. Compromise agreements, employment tribunal costs, absent costs, recruitment costs, replacement costs, the impact of the business is great, and it's felt now more than it ever has been. Suddenly an HR director is having to sign off on one hand a redundancy consultation to reduce your headcount by 10%, and the next minute they've got a compromise agreement put in front of them to comp out one of your employees at £50,000 for a dispute that probably could have been resolved much earlier. And that HR director is saying, but hang on, this is not good business practice. On one hand, we're losing good people because we don't have sufficient resources, and on the other hand, we're wasting resources to compromise good people out of our business because we have not got a facility for resolving disputes that really should never have got to the point that it got to, where it's cost us the harm and damage. So it's not time for business as usual. And my view, in the way that I read that, is it's time to take our grievance procedure, in particular, to the nearest shredding machine and be away with it. The grievance procedure, as I will be arguing today, is a serious and has a serious and detrimental effect on our organisations. Now, some businesses I talk to say to me, but David, we have very low levels of grievances. We're very fortunate. We actually resolve all of our disputes without actually going into grievance. And I say that's fantastic. You know, really celebrate the work you're doing. But does it not tell its own story that you actively avoid going into the very procedure that you designed and chose to help you resolve disputes and conflicts? Does it not suggest that the procedure is failing and that there's a reliance on discretionary practice within the organisation as an alternative to a well-thought-through policy document with clear toolkits and clear guidance? Other organisations at the other end of the spectrum are experiencing an incredible level of grievances, a real grievance culture within their organisations. And HR business partners, HR managers and directors and others, unions and others, of course, are being tied up in knots dealing with issues where really would it not be better for those two parties to sit down in a room and have a conversation with each other. And the best illustration I can give for this is I was working with a small company recently, and two very senior managers had raised a grievance against each other. There were counter grievances, as is often the case with these things. And the HR director offered informal resolution. Both parties rejected that. And the HR director had no choice, really, but to investigate the two grievances and made a very clear statement to both of the parties. If you communicate with each other during the course of this investigation, you will be subject to disciplinary action. Now, the due process, of course, is probably right when we talk about due process. But my analysis of the situation is the world's gone mad. How can we get ourselves in a position where two intelligent, high-performing, decent managers within an organisation have had a falling out, they feel all of the negative fight and flight and all of the negative stuff that's associated with the conflict, and we understand that and recognise that's difficult, and they're told due process says you must no longer speak to each other, otherwise you could be subject to disciplinary action. My view as a mediator is get the two parties in a room, lock the door and don't let them out until they've reached resolution. I mean, that doesn't sound very mediated, of course. What I'm actually saying is let's find a way for getting these two people around the table, opening up lines of communication, opening up dialogue, and helping them find a solution. That particular case I was talking about, there was no case to answer on either side. Neither grievance was upheld, and what happened ultimately, they both went around the table and resolved their differences with mediation, and I was there to help them to do that. What was fascinating, however, that was then 3 or 4 months since the original conflict had been first escalated and first identified. That's 4 wasted months in the relationship between those two managers at a time where the business needed them to be performing well. So here's a situation and a scenario, perhaps it's a fictitious situation, but you may recognise some of this. So James is recruited to team leader in his organisation 6 months ago. Zoe also applied for the job, but she was unsuccessful. She's never really been told why. She never sought the advice. She was a bit embarrassed. She wasn't confident. It hurt her ego and her esteem. So she didn't apply. She didn't seek out the feedback. And of course, James, he never knew that Zoe applied for the role. So they were working together, James as the line manager. He's relatively new to line management, James. He was looking forward to the opportunity. However, Zoe clearly wasn't happy from almost the day that he started in his new role. She began to resist his management almost from the get-go. They haven't met for a while now. They haven't met at a one-to-one. There are no lines of communication. Any conversations that they have are grabbed conversations. They feel confrontational, hostile. They really feel quite negative and destructive. Zoe's performance is falling. She's frequently late for work. James doesn't know what to do about it. He doesn't dare to challenge her. He doesn't dare to challenge her performance. Her colleagues now can see this is happening. It's having repercussions across the team. The team is starting to feel a little frustrated. Zoe can be sarcastic and rude. She'll sit in meetings with James and sigh and roll her eyes, and she just doesn't really engage with team or with James in the meetings. But James himself is becoming stressed and anxious. He's waking up at night. He's a good sleeper, James. He doesn't really experience amnesia, and amnesia. He doesn't normally wake up during the night. And but as a result of feeling tired and stressed out, he recently snapped at Zoe, and said, look, you're just wasting my time, you're really driving me nuts, we've got to, I've had enough, basically. Zoe felt this was a direct attack on her. She was very unhappy with James's behaviour. She approached HR wanting to take out a grievance. On the very same day, James approached HR wanting them to dismiss Zoe for various reasons relating to her performance. So you might recognise some of that. And what HR said to James and Zoe is, look, can you please go and try and find some kind of an outcome? Look, we have a very empowering approach to dispute resolution in our organisation. Our grievance procedure states that we promote informal resolution. Look, we have a whole sentence dedicated to it. So why don't we go and do that? And this is what happens. It just blows up. Now, it may well start well, both parties are trying to have a conversation, but there are no guidelines, no ground rules, no one feels confident supporting them, there's no third party there to support them. They want to have an open and frank conversation, they both know that they need to, but very quickly it becomes emotive, it becomes hostile, the arms are waved, and basically it kicks off. So within 5 minutes, both parties are back on the phone to HR. Yet we tried informal resolution, and as we suspected, it wasn't going to work. We'd now like to go into a formal process of performance management or grievance, and HR sigh and say those famous words, here we go again. And this is what happens now. We start to adopt our position, the trenches get dug, the walls get built. I win, you lose, I'm right, you're wrong, don't blame me, I don't trust you, who do you think you are? I'll see you in court. The language becomes more negative and more polarised. One party sees themselves as right. Well, James is right. No, Zoe's right. But of course, both parties see themselves as right. That's how they identify themselves, their beliefs, their sense of self, their schema. They define themselves right. We don't walk around defining ourselves as being wrong. So any suggestion by the other side that I'm wrong is a direct attack on me. So very quickly what we see is the parties perceive or anticipate an attack from the other side, and we defend ourselves against the attack. And what's the best form of defense? Attack or withdraw. So quickly we've moved into a formal policy framework. The policy framework has polarized us. We're now defending ourselves against the potential attack by the other party. The best form of attack is the best form of defense is attack or withdraw. So the very policy that was designed to help us resolve our differences has now entrenched us and caused us to adopt positions which are increasingly hostile, vitriolic, and dogmatic. So that system, that grievance process, unless someone within your organisation is highly gifted or is trained as a mediator, as a diplomat, or you happen to have people within your organisation who have high levels of emotional intelligence and are able to bring those two parties together and can get James and Zoe having a conversation with each other, the chances are now they're going to experience a very difficult and challenging period in their lives as HR try to make some sense of this and senior managers try to find some kind of a solution that's going to support that. But the policy itself, the grievance procedure, is reactive. It's reacting to these circumstances. It doesn't anticipate conflict. It reacts when they occur. It's an inherently adversarial process. When you go through your grievance procedures, I'll be recommending that you do, you'll be surprised at just how much of the policy is based on an adversarial system of dispute resolution, which is about winners and losers. Often it's about losers and losers, or a zero-sum game. And that's what, in essence, grievance procedures offer, a zero-sum game aligned with zero-sum value. Those grievance procedures polarize the parties, as I've suggested. They very rarely identify the root cause of conflict. One of the questions I would ask you in your looking at your grievance procedure is what scope is there within your grievance procedure to enable the parties to have a conversation about what's happened with the view of deriving learning and insight from the past relationships in order for them to be able to achieve future success in their relationship. I would suggest that in the majority of grievance procedures I see, there is very little scope for the parties to derive learning from the conflict. So the only way that the parties can examine the past relationship is to identify blame, guilt, evidence, mitigation, corroboration. The past is all about blame. And we use that blame to build a case against each other. And of course, the organisation promotes that. What we're looking at in mediation is looking at the past of a dispute to understand what's gone wrong, to identify the root cause and build a stronger relationship for tomorrow. So the needs of the individuals are not met, the needs of your business is not met through the procedure. And the grievance procedure, in doing so, impedes creativity. And this is a major issue within organisations. You know, where's the next new big product going to come from in your organisation? Where's the next innovation? One thing is for sure, it's not going to come from the people sat at home today watching Homes Under the Hammer because they can't face being in the office with their colleagues or their manager. That's a fact. So you're paying people and employing people who can't contribute to the economic success of your organisation because the processes of your organisation are not enabling them to resolve their differences. Whereas mediation and dialogue, of course, it opens up the potential for the parties to find successful or innovative solutions. Again, let me illustrate the point. Let's imagine that James and Zoe are in a mediation meeting. And James is talking to Zoe about her not providing the information on time to him. That holds up his workflow. He finds it really frustrating and he feels like she's not performing. And Zoe's saying, well, the problem I've got, James, is I don't get the information from Mike until Thursday. You're asking for the report on Thursday evening, and I need the report from the information from Mike much earlier for me to get the report to you. And James can hear that and listen to that and say, well, do you know something? Mike has that information. He's sat on it for 2 days. I didn't know that issue was a problem. I'll go back to Mike and ask him to get the information to you, Zoe, on a Tuesday. You can prepare your report for me on the Wednesday. I've got it on time, and the performance management issue no longer exists. So in that very short conversation, James and Zoe have started to resolve some of the substantive relationship issues that exist between them, but they've also identified innovative systemic changes in the way that that team functions and the way that information is distributed. Grievance procedures do not allow for that level of conversation to happen. They do not offer systemic or structural benefit to the organisation. So conflicts occur. I'm just going to kind of tease out some of the psychology here of conflict and understand how conflicts occur and why they occur. We often think about conflict as a display of behaviours between the parties, you know, war, combat, clash, confrontation. And this is the kind of language we often use to describe behaviours. And most organisations' policies and procedures exist to mitigate and reduce behaviours. And you know, I would guess most people on this webinar, the most recent HR policy you would have designed would be a social media policy to protect your organisation against any harm from inappropriate behaviour on social media. So our organisations are very good and adept at developing policies and procedures which protect the organisation against inappropriate behaviour from its employees. That's the right thing to do. But in conflict, which is far more complicated, we talked earlier about the black and white polarity of conflict. Well, we all know that conflict is about perceptions, feelings, needs, hopes, fears, aspirations, goals, objectives, the unspoken elements of our relationships, the psychological contract. Yet when it goes wrong, we only focus on the behaviours. Well, as a mediator, what I'm really interested in is identifying the underlying needs of the parties. So in Zoe's case, she needed some information about why she didn't achieve the job. She needs some coaching and support. She's clearly ambitious. She needs to understand how she can express her ambitions in her role. She maybe feels she's not confident. She needs to have some confidence building and rebuild her esteem after she hadn't been successful in the role. James needs to be respected and supported as a new manager in his role. But when that support and respect, or that nurturing and coaching isn't present, both parties experience some form of loss. And this loss can be profound: a loss of faith, a loss of hope, a loss of esteem, a loss of certainty, a loss of future. People always say to me, David, well, what's the point of going into the room with the other person because they'll never change and nothing's ever going to change in my business? I think that's one of the saddest things that I ever hear as a mediator. How did you get to a position where you applied for the post in your organisation and felt so good about coming into the organisation, so positive? Maybe the next day you got a card from your parents saying, we're really proud of you, well done, well, you know, congratulations, this is a great opportunity for you. And within 6 months, you can't be bothered to get out of bed, and you hold a view that nothing's ever going to change. And that's driven by a strong sense of loss that we're experiencing. And one of the most powerful forms of loss that we experience is a loss of control. And Zoe and James are out of control. And that's why they come into HR, to give some sense of control, and it's not forthcoming. And that lack of control is one of the most powerful causes of stress and trauma. If we look at the work of psychologists like Martin Seligman, the founder of the School of Positive Psychology, he tells us that a lack of control for parties, for individuals, is a major cause of stress for those individuals, stress and harm. So that loss then creates a whole array of emotional and psychological responses. And we felt conflict. We know the feeling of conflict. We know the rush of adrenaline, the cortisol, the various hormones that are related to conflict. Our brain starts to function differently. A little part of our brain, the amygdala, begins to fire off the hormones that we need. Now, that's all well and good if I'm being chased down a prairie by a saber-toothed tiger, because the adrenaline is fantastic. It gives blood to my muscles. It protects my vital organs. I'm really focused on it. I'm running away from the saber-toothed tiger, and I'm get up the tree 100 meters away. I can run away. I'm panting and puffing, and of course the feedback loop in our body, I'm then excreting the hormones that cause me to get that push. And we have exactly the same response when a manager is looking over my shoulder, criticizing my work. The only difference there is there's no tree to run up. There's no place for me to excrete the hormones. So unless we go for a run after work or we engage in some physical exercise, I'm sat at their desk feeling sick, sad, lonely, frustrated, vulnerable, isolated, a whole array of feelings. And then those feelings come out in how we act, how we interact, and how we react to the conflict. And what we see in conflict is people react differently. They interact in a different way. They respond differently because of those emotions. But the good news for you as an HR director and for us as mediators is those are choices that people have made. And in mediation, what we offer people is an opportunity to examine the impact of the choices that they've made, to understand the impact of the conflict upon themselves, to describe it to each other in an empathetic, understanding way to one another, and in doing so, have a positive conversation with each other that they can then make new choices going forward. And that's what the resolution policy offers to organisations. So I'm going to introduce you now to the resolution policy and talk you through how the policy works. So hopefully I can end that part by saying conflict doesn't have to be negative and destructive. It can be positive and constructive. And the challenge for you as an HR director in your organisation is what are HR doing right now to transform conflict into a constructive, positive force within your organisation. So what I'll do is everyone who's on the webinar, I'll email you a copy of the resolution policy after the session. So I'll talk you through it now, and then I'll send you a copy of it after the webinar. The first thing to do is very simple. I'm going to run through a couple of audits for you to help you get started in terms of a review of your grievance procedure. You probably ascertained at this point that I'm not a big fan of the grievance procedure, but I know over 99% of organisations have them. I never work out why. There's no need to have them unless it's in your contract of employment. There's no statutory duty to have a grievance procedure. Obviously, we have to follow ACAS guidance on discipline and grievance, but there are a set of minimum standards that even the tiniest micro-organisation should really be following. So as long as you're following the ACAS guidance, and of course the policy I'm sharing with you does follow the ACAS guidance, there's no issue there. But there's no need to have a grievance procedure. So just to reassure you of that. So how to go about changing this? Well, the first thing is maybe take a green pen and a red pen. You might have a copy of your grievance procedure in front of you. And with the red pen, mark all of the parts of your procedure which are formal or adversarial, draconian, about win-lose outcomes or lose-lose outcomes, about sanction or argument. And with a green pen, mark all of the words which are informal, about safety. Is there a safe space in your procedure for conversations to happen? How many times does the word empathy feature in your grievance procedure? Oh, and by the way, if it features once, please do send it to me. I'd love to see it. I've yet to see a grievance procedure that includes the word empathy in it, but you might have one, and I'd love to see it. It's about dialogue, resolution, non-adversarial approaches, collaborative outcomes, consensus, mediation, win-win outcomes. And when you look at the red and the green pen, you'll be surprised. I can see people are still trying to sign in. You'll be surprised at just how much red pen there is on the policy. Now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be red pen on your policy, but what I'm saying is there should be an equal balance of green and red pen. So mini grievance order, this is some questions for you to take away from the webinar and maybe begin a conversation with your HR team and undertake a little review of your grievance procedure. How many grievances did you receive last year? How many resolved at informal resolution? Do you know that? Do you monitor and evaluate and measure how many informal resolutions that are being done by your managers. Does informal resolution feature in your senior managers' job roles and core competences? Are you training your senior managers in the art of informal resolution? How many grievances became formalised? How many were upheld? I was at a large local government organisation recently, and I was very surprised to hear that only 8% of their grievances have been upheld in the last 12 months. They've had a real spike in grievances, only 8% upheld. And I went to another organisation in the private sector, and I was listening to them talk about grievances. I was surprised to hear this organisation had only had 8% of grievances upheld. They said, "You're joking, we only had 2% of grievances upheld." So 98% of those people's employees have been told they were basically not telling the truth, or in some respects that they've got it wrong. And when I asked the organisation what they do with the 98% of cases that aren't upheld, the answer was pretty much nothing. The parties were just expected to get on with it. How much time was spent by you and your teams handling these grievances? How much did they cost your business? They do have a real cost. It can run into tens of thousands of pounds. Do you measure the satisfaction levels of the parties? You probably measure satisfaction on many different elements of your business. Do you measure satisfaction amongst aggrieved employees or people who've been through the process? Brand. Did you measure that? Did you measure the impact on engagement or reputation? And then the final question is, what value did the grievance procedure add to your business in the past 12 months? These are questions really to get you thinking about your grievance procedure. Most organisations, and I've worked with over 300 organisations to transform them from an adversarial system to a collaborative system of dispute resolution. The question number 9, when I asked that question to organisations, most senior HR professionals, HR directors and other business leaders tell me that the grievance procedure added 0 value to the organisation in the past 12 months. No value. There was no intrinsic or inherent value whatsoever of having a grievance procedure, which I think is a fascinating and quite damning indictment on the procedure that's of choice for dispute resolution in your organisation. And some disputes, as we know from the changes to employment law which have been announced, are big news. It's a big area of activities. We've got to get this right, yet our systems and processes are failing. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. So the TCM model resolution policy is a very new approach to grievance and complaints resolution. When I was talking to colleagues at the CIPD about the resolution policy, one of the questions asked me is it not just a change in name? Is it not semantics? And I said, absolutely it is. Conflict is about conversations, but conflict is about communication. Conflict is about language. And if we apply the word grievance, which is associated with betrayal, loss, anger, frustration, being let down, if we apply that procedure, at times when people feel vulnerable and emotive, then yes, the language really, really does matter. So applying language which is more solution-focused, more future-focused, more resolution-focused, yes, it's about language. But it's a big step in the right direction, even just to change the title of your grievance procedure to a resolution procedure. Most organisations, of course, have a clearly stated set of values, and the values may be about respect, about empathy, about collaborating with each other, about being innovative. And suddenly your resolution policy starts to incorporate that kind of language. Your resolution policy has a direct link there, therefore, to the values of your business. There's a better system for triaging cases in the procedure. HR now can triage cases and identify the most suitable route to resolution rather than being at the end of the phone when the manager says, help, I need you to come in and resolve an issue. It's like, how long has it been going on for? Well, a year. It's like, well, perhaps you could have called me 12 months ago and we could have had this conversation. Oh, I didn't want to. I didn't think it would blow up, or I thought it would go away. As these things never do. So there's a much greater role that HR can play in proactively identifying the right route to resolution. And the best route to resolution is for managers and employees to have a conversation with each other, or for those conversations to be mediated. And so you won't be surprised to hear there's a real focus in the policy on resolution meetings delivered by managers and employees, and on the role of mediation and early resolution. Mediation remains voluntary in your organisation's policy. However, it is reasonable for you to expect within your organisation that your employees won't just throw mediation out because they don't want to meet with each other. So there's a mediation information session which is provided for your employees so they can get good quality information about mediation and make an informed choice about whether or not to engage in mediation. For every one good reason why I give to a party why I think mediation is the right route for them, I'm up to 1,654 really good reasons why they should never sit in a room with the other person. And out of those, I've never heard one really good reason why they should never sit in a room with the other person. It's based on misperception, perception, prejudice, fear, anxiety of repercussions, and so on and so forth. But when we actually break it down, I've never really heard a genuinely sound reason why people can't sit in a room with each other. And I would suggest as an organisation, you can place much greater emphasis on people having adult-to-adult conversations and moving into this interest-based process of dispute resolution, which, as we know, for many organisations, from my experience, is far more effective. So it's compliant with the ACAS code, as I've already suggested. I've checked with ACAS now a couple of times to ensure it meets the minimum standards. ACAS are absolutely delighted to see this new policy on the arriving, by the way. I work very closely with colleagues within ACAS to ensure that our policies and our work is meeting the minimum standards. It does, of course, offer opportunities to escalate to formal action, and there is a route to move to investigation and formal resolution meetings in those cases where perhaps it's a more contractual issue or where there's more serious misconduct where you think as an HR director, hang on, I would prefer to go to an investigation route before I go to mediation because it could be serious. Absolutely, that is catered for in this procedure. It's not going soft on every issue. It's just providing the parties with the disputes, and we know the kind of disputes that are more suitable for this, the interpersonal relationship breakdown, performance management issues, get the parties around the table much more quickly. It will free you up to then focus on the more serious cases. It also includes a series of toolkits, as I'll explain. So we set up mediation programs in a wide array of organisations. I'll share a couple of case studies, Marks and Spencer's and BT and the T, but we set up mediation programs in the United Nations, EDF Energy, Department for Work and Pensions, across the Home Office, Metropolitan Police, various other Whitehall departments, private sector companies, but the BT experience and Marks and Spencer experience are the ones that I'm going to draw on today. So BT, we set up a pilot mediation program. We often work with larger companies to set up pilot resolution programs or pilot mediation programs, enable the organisation to feel their way through it, to evaluate and measure the success. And Carol Russell, the head of employee relations, commissioned us to set up a pilot scheme in BT Retail before it was rolled out across BT Group, which is the work is well underway for that area of activity. And within BT, like many organisations, before they started offering mediation, one of the only real choices for their employees was to go down the formal route, and that was costing BT a lot of money. And putting an end to that within BT was the real selling point for their business. But even more important was being able to get in quickly and address issues before they became entrenched. And Carol and her team, I trained her and her team as mediators, and very quickly they saw that mediation was the best route to resolution. I think in the first year of operation, they mediated over 300 cases, and in the first year reported savings of over £500,000 directly attributable to the role of mediation, and that was over a 20-fold increase, a 20-fold ROI on the initial cost of implementation within BT. Having rolled it out across the BT Group, the first year savings, according to Caroline Waters, who's now left BT, the head of People and Policy, was over £1 million savings in the first year of introducing mediation, again directly attributable. And I would suggest that we're only scratching at the surface in those organisations. More work needs to be done, but more work is being done to promote mediation and roll this out. So the resolution policy has a simple content and structure. It's very straightforward. It's not complicated. It doesn't need to be complicated. So the first stage is an issue is raised by an individual employee within your organisation. They might raise that with an HR business partner, with their manager, with a union colleague. So all of those key stakeholders need to be trained in how to spot and identify conflict and how to triage a case effectively. So key players will be occupational health, your staff side, unions, partners, HR business partners, managers and supervisors. So providing them with the key skills that they need to be able to spot a conflict early and also to respond when people raise an issue with them. So the triage is undertaken by the manager or HR, and there are two routes to resolution. The preferred route, of course, would be early resolution. And the early resolution may be a resolution meeting between the employee and the manager, providing some coaching support. Interestingly, I was talking to some senior HR business partners from an organisation, and they've all now been trained in mediation and coaching skills to help them to resolve disputes quickly and effectively using, well, basically mentoring, coaching, and mediation. And they see those three core competencies being directly aligned to the Ulrich principles of HR business partnering. So very interesting. Mentoring, coaching, and mediation are a major driver now in that organisation's HR practices. There may be mediation by a line manager, and again, training some of your senior managers in mediation skills, ensuring that your line managers are recruited with the basic levels of emotional intelligence that you need to run a diverse and progressive business, ensuring that they possess basic levels of empathy, the ability to engage, and supporting them to have these difficult conversations. HR are therefore there as an enabler and a supporter of early resolution. It may be that the manager or others are conflicted, and in those cases we'd recommend having access to an external mediator or an internal mediator. And again, in BT, we've trained over 50 internal mediators within that organisation. With Transport for London, London Underground, we've trained over 100 internal mediators within those organisations. So organisations increasingly will have access to one or some or a panel of internal mediators who can be brought in to help resolve the dispute quickly and effectively. It may well be at the triage stage there needs to be some form of a formal resolution process. There may be an escalation there to an investigation into the matters to establish the facts of the matter, and that would be a precursor to a formal resolution meeting. Of course, the employee would have right to representation at the resolution meeting. But even at the resolution meeting, we recognise that most conflicts are not black and white. So even once a finding has been made by the determination panel, the grievance panel, we still recommend going back to some form of mediation to repair the harm and the damage within the organisation, within that relationship. So even at the latter stages of the resolution process, there's an emphasis on resolving the issues. And these are the possible approaches. So I've just highlighted some of them in the map there. This is a little bit more detail. So a neutral evaluation or assessment undertaken by managers, HR or unions, mediation delivered by managers, delivered by internal mediators or delivered by external mediators, team building or team development work within teams, again using a mediation model, coaching provided to the individuals or to managers on how to have and how to set up and run a difficult conversation. I don't know how many people on this call have been trained in how to set up a safe space and boundary setting, but it seems to be a skill that's sadly lacking for many managers. So one of the skills that I'll often impart to managers, a very simple skill, is when you're setting up a meeting, before you start, set out clear objectives for the meeting and establish some ground rules. You know, what I'd ask everyone in the meeting to do is to speak respectfully, to be courteous, and to listen to each other, and please be open and honest throughout the meeting. And managers will ring me up a week later or a month later and say, wow, that one single process of setting boundaries and establishing a safe space has transformed how I have my meetings. So if there's one thing that you can take back to your managers perhaps after this webinar, is reminding them of the importance of boundary setting. So resolution meetings, again, TCM we train, when we provide all of the support and training, I guess this is part of the webinar, is telling a little bit about what we do as a business. We provide support on every single one of these different elements and interventions, both delivering them and training others to deliver them, and right the way through to investigations and formal resolution meetings, which are the key approaches. Again, there's much more detail in the resolution policy that you'll get after the webinar. So what makes this different? Well, you've probably got a sense of what makes it different. I suppose at the heart of what makes it different is about collaborating, not blaming. The resolution policy promotes and encourages positive relationships. It builds constructive dialogue. It's about leaders and managers walking the talk. In the words of David McLeod and Nita Clark, it's about closing the say-do gap within the organisation. And suddenly, and I would suggest that your grievance procedure exacerbates the say-do gap. I would suggest that having a grievance procedure actually is what I call the HR paradox. I'm an engagement guru on Engage for Success and very active at Engage for Success, so I meet many HR directors who are passionate about employee engagement, but those same HR directors as I'm talking to them, I'm often getting phone calls or emails on their BlackBerrys or iPhones from an HR manager who's at an employment tribunal or a grievance meeting that day. And that defines for me the paradox. On one hand, as HR professionals, you are committed to building an engaged, healthy, happy workforce. And on the other hand, you're the custodians of a set of policies and procedures which would tear relationships asunder. And personally, this is a personal view, I think it does the HR brand no good at all to have that paradox existing. I think the policies and procedures need to be aligned to the HR strategy. The HR strategy needs to be aligned to the values of the organisation, and unfortunately grievance procedures are aligned to neither. So the T7, this is the language you're going to see emerging in your organisation's policy. It's about fairness, mutual respect, it's about empathy and dignity and building dialogue. And suddenly this language, it changes the focus and the language of your resolution policy and grievance policy from something which is negative experience to something a little bit more positive. I realise it's difficult when I'm on the webinar. So it's 49 minutes. So I planned the webinar for 45 minutes. I've got a couple more slides to run. I do run other webinars. I run webinars on setting up internal mediation schemes, the mediation employee engagement, the psychological contract. You name it. If it moves at the moment, we run a webinar on it. And all of our webinars are on our website. They're all free of charge, by the way, so you're welcome to sign up to any or as many as you wish. But I will just spend a moment, if you can bear with me just for a little while, just talking through now the role that mediation can play and just define the terms. I know some of you will already be using mediation, but for others it may be a little bit new. So just to define what we mean by the word. So it's a non-adversarial way of resolving our difficulties. It's used as an alternative or increasingly as an adjunct to or working alongside formal or legal processes. Mediation is a mindset, it's a way of thinking, it's a framework, something we do, it's a process, and it's a set of competencies and skills that we can use. That's what I call my tripartite definition of mediation. It makes mediation very accessible. No longer is mediation seen as a Kofi Annan type figure from the United Nations being parachuted into a dispute, and everyone goes, wow, I didn't really want the UN involved. I thought it was just this office spat. It's actually a way of thinking, behaving, and working, and like I say, it makes it a much more accessible kind of language. The mediator is and needs to remain neutral at all times. They're not there to take sides or to tell people what they should be doing. They're there to promote and foster an environment where people can have an open and honest conversation with each other, helping them to identify a mutually acceptable a win-win outcome. And mediation is about collaborating and building consensus rather than pointing fingers and blaming. Of course, we're taught from a very young age that what we want to get is about blaming. I've got a 4-year-old, Daniel, and I don't know where he's picked it up, but he's just learned the phrase, it's not fair. And everything is learning that language, it's not fair, how blame and it becomes part of almost the vocabulary from a very young age. So there is perhaps a cultural shift that goes alongside what I'm talking about. Any agreement in mediation comes directly from the parties. It's not imposed by the mediator. The mediator doesn't even make suggestions, which can be quite challenging. And the mediator is not there to judge or to tell those involved what they should be doing. And it's a voluntary process. People have to engage in it because they want to. But as I said, I think it's reasonable for us to expect employees to give it good consideration. And it's a confidential process. There's no notes, records, minutes or audit trail comes out of mediation. In fact, the opposite is true. Everything that I write in the mediation process is torn up or shredded at the end of the mediation process. That way, there's no chance of it appearing in a little bundle somewhere or being put onto a personal file. The only thing that would be kept at the end of the mediation is the agreement between the parties. I'm going to go into a lot more detail into this in some of my other webinars. And I'm happy, by the way, to come out and talk to you and your HR team about mediation. We've just launched a mediation video, and I'll send you the link to that, which goes through the mediation process in more detail. So there's a lot of information from TCM which explains what mediation is and how it works. But always at the end of the phone or an email to answer any questions. So mediation really has entered without being offered mediation. It's no longer the UK's best kept secret. It's really as part of the vocabulary of dispute resolution in this country. And I would believe that the introduction of fees for employment tribunals is a very mediation-friendly move by the coalition government. Whatever one's views are in terms of access to justice and the employment tribunal reforms, my view as a mediator is it presents a great opportunity for employees and employers to avoid the employment tribunals. After all, the employment tribunal is the least best place to resolve our differences, and it puts a much greater emphasis on early resolution. And I know colleagues from the Ministry of Justice and from Departments of Business are both really keen to see companies mediating, which is probably why my webinar has been so popular. So there's different stages for setting up a mediation scheme. Again, I can send you some information. It doesn't have to be too onerous, but if you're looking at setting something up in your organisation, it is worth taking a bit of time to do it properly, and we do it properly at TCM. We've got a great track record of setting up effective and high-performing mediation schemes in some very, very complex organisations, from micro businesses right the way through to global corporates. I've highlighted number 5. That seems to be where the biggest financial investment often is about recruiting a team of internal mediators. But those people will deliver a real benefit to your business, and having a team of internal mediators is one of the most powerful ways of resolving disputes in your organisation. Again, if you'd like any information about setting up an internal mediation scheme, we've got brochures and information available here. I'm very happy to provide that. And these are some of the benefits. It's incredible, the power of mediation. It's a magical process. I never meet a party who wants to mediate. Let's be honest, none of us probably would. It's like going to the dentist. We know we need to go to the dentist. We know oral hygiene is important, but having a poking around in our mouth with a sharp implement is probably not something that personally is my favourite thing to do. But I know that if I don't do it, teeth and gums, so I know I need to go through that. And of course, I come out at the end of it feeling fresher and clearer, and my teeth are clean, and I know actually it reminds me of why I've done and mediation's much the same. But these are some of the benefits that the key overview of NHS Trust, looking at how NHS organisations are handling disputes and conflicts and working with a credibility that other providers just don't have. They stand out head and shoulders above the rest. And when Marks and Spencer say that about you, then you know you've probably arrived. Oh, I see the slides have moved. So final slide then is possible next steps for yourselves. I hope it's inspired you today to think differently about your grievance procedure. Sorry it's taken so much of your time up this morning, but I hope it's been a valuable hour that we spent together talking about conflict resolution and grievance procedures. Possible next steps is thinking about your grievance procedure. If you don't feel ready to introduce a resolution policy, why don't you just add the word resolution after your grievance policy and have a grievance resolution policy? It's a halfway house. It's introducing the word resolution, and it's one way of actually helping to make that level. Use external mediators to help you resolve a dispute at work, and of course we provide mediators from TCM. Or train you to yourself to become a workplace mediator. It's a wonderful skill set. If you're already a mediator, you'll know how fantastic it is being a mediator and watching the parties at the beginning of the process, tentative and nervous, and at the end of the process, giving each other a hug and saying, you know, let's make this work. Developing a pool of internal mediators, I've mentioned, I think is a very powerful way of offering mediation, and equipping your managers and HR team with the skills to spot, prevent, and resolve disputes. So in conclusion, finally, it does seem now it's time to let go of our SSA or grievance procedures. There's no reason to have them. The only reason that you would have a grievance procedure is through your own choice. And I would suggest that that might not be the most appropriate choice for the modern progressive organisation. Resolution policies offer a new name, a new focus, and a new remedy. There really are a range of mediation options available to your company, and mediation offers and delivers real benefits and return on investment. So thank you very much for listening. It actually says participating, but there hasn't, obviously, a webinar. It's always slightly unusual because there's not much room for participation. So thank you very much for participating. I sent you a LinkedIn profile. I know I've connected with a number of you on LinkedIn, and I'm just looking. There have been some questions here as well. So if you do want to stay online, then actually there's been quite a lot of questions. So what I would suggest doing is I will probably just see if I can get that open now and have a look at some of these questions. Now what I'll probably do is I'll send out a response to these questions. I'll just type them up and send out a response as part of our email. So there's been a few questions there. But I hope you've found the webinar useful. I think we're up to time now. So thank you very much, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll be sending the TCM Group's Model Resolution Policy shortly. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and will join us for our next webinar, Setting Up an Internal Mediation Scheme, on the 16th of August. Many thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.